Let's talk about sustainability communication. Now, this first quote is not from one of the articles that I assigned. It's from an article that I no longer assign because some of the information in it is better expressed in the articles that I assigned for this week. But this is a really great quote about the essence of what communication is. The necessity of communication can be found in the anthropologic circumstance that each consciousness is isolated. Our near physiological, cognitive, emotional processes are mutually unobservable, and there is no direct access to the thoughts, attitudes, and intentions of the other. It is through communication that the interior is exteriorized. Communication is thus the principle of societal organization itself. I often say that sometimes it seems like everything is a communication problem. If we don't understand something in the way that it was meant, it's a communication problem. It's some kind of communication breakdown. If we're having trouble communicating with our partner, if we're having conflict with our partner, it's probably in large part because we're not communicating effectively. If we're struggling to understand a message from a politician, it could be because they're not communicating clearly. If a politician is attempting to deceive us, then whether or not we understand that deception, then that can also be a communication problem. So, a lot of things, I mean, we are social animals, humans are. And essentially, we are each, our brains are contained in our skulls. So, essentially, we have um, these ideas that are self contained. And until we somehow communicate those ideas, they stay inside of us. That's what this quote is about. These ideas are inside of us. So that leads us to a two pronged problem. How do we get those ideas outside of us effectively? And how do we know how to communicate to those other brains that are out there? Okay? Because each brain represents a different set of circumstances, a different set of experiences, a different set of um, knowledge, and all of these come together to make us who we are. Okay? So we organize society through communication. We problem solve through communication. We ask for and receive help and assistance through communication. So we use communication to have our needs met, to create connection, to empathize, to expand knowledge and understanding. It is through the power of communication, and often story in particular, that we can show other ways of knowing. And this is particularly important for sustainability communication because we are often communicating complex ideas. We might be communicating ideas that some people are uncomfortable with. We might be suggesting um, new solutions, maybe solutions to sustainability problems that some of our audience has never heard before, or maybe it in some way challenges their sense of self. And we need tools to communicate effectively, and story is one of those tools. The task of sustainability communication lies in introducing an understanding of the world, that is, of the relationship between humans and their environment, into social discourse, developing a critical awareness of the problems about this relationship, and then relating them to societal norms and values. So, just to recap, people relate to sustainability through their personal situation and their own knowledge, expectations, beliefs, and values. So, we have to take into account our audience. We have to understand where our audience is coming from. A lot of sustainability issues have become really politicized, which is unfortunate, but it's also the reality. And so we have to have a sense of people's worldviews and values and what their expectations are of the situation so that we can communicate in a way that's effective. Now I want to talk a bit about this last quote on this page. Fish may die, or human beings swimming in lakes and rivers may cause illnesses. No more oil may come from the pumps, and average temperatures may rise or fall. But as long as this is not communicated, it doesn't have any effect on society. I think that this is a really important quote for us to think about. So, back in the 80s, I remember when I first heard about climate change. And I recall feeling quite distressed about this idea. It seemed like something that we really needed to pay attention to. It seemed like something that wasn't going to get better on its own. We had to take action to do something about it. And for a while, it seemed like the people that needed to be talking about this were talking about it. And it was not yet politicized. So people like Margaret Thatcher were talking about climate change and how we needed to address it. Jimmy Carter was putting solar panels on the roof of the White House. Um, it was being addressed by public figures in a way that seemed like this was kind of urgent. And then it has now been proven that backed lobbyists and think tanks, backed by, in particular, uh, fossil fuel um, uh, funds, really tried to cloud the science of climate change and create just enough doubt that people would question it and it would kind of foil action on these issues. And sure enough, it worked. And it worked to the point that it shut down communication almost entirely on climate change. Media didn't really want to cover climate change. I mean, it wasn't the sort of issue that was front and center. So if public figures who had a large platform weren't talking about climate change, when would you talk about it? Well, maybe if there was a big disaster that happened that could be linked to climate change. But in the early days, there was still that element of doubt. So, is this particular unusual weather pattern, is this related to climate change or not? Now we have uh, better rubrics for that. We have more knowledge and more study has gone into that. But back in the day, it was harder, and the climate impacts were not as extreme as they are today. So there wasn't really a good time, or at least it didn't seem like that, to talk about these things. And if there was a disaster, you know what I remember is that if people brought it up, if it was mentioned on the news or something, there was this big, well, we shouldn't be talking about this right now because people are suffering. That was kind of the pushback that you'd always get. So I would say that for nearly 30 years, there was very little discussion about climate change. And when it was brought up, often what you got was you got two talking heads. One that was for climate change and one that was against climate change. Well, this was nuts because even back 20, 30, 40 years ago, there was um, consensus on the science of climate change. Like the consensus has firmed up and grown, but there was by and large pretty broad consensus on the science. There might have been a little bit of, uh, disagreement on specifics, but the consensus was there almost from the beginning. So, why were was mainstream media giving a doubter the same weight as someone who had experience in this field and was knowledgeable and understood the science? It doesn't make sense, but that is how it was approached. We could definitely at some point have a discussion about that. So anyway, so this matters because we've had 40 years of inaction. 40 years. So all this stuff was going on, but it was not being recognized, not in a meaningful way. That is the reason that communication is so vital. If we don't talk about something, it doesn't happen. But it does happen, of course, because climate change does continue to progress. Uh, and, in the meantime, we kind of have our heads in the sand. Now, um, I want to point out that people knew this. There were a lot of people who understood that this was a problem. It just needed salience, it just needed to be talked about as at least a first step. And so I don't agree with everything that Greenpeace does, but I do think that they understood this problem. And so many of their actions, the majority of their actions, were meant to catch the attention of media because there was kind of this void around climate change. So, how do you get the media to address climate change? Well, you have to make an event that's newsworthy. So that was the model for drawing attention to climate change and other issues. And so Greenpeace was one of the organizations that was somewhat successful of breaking through this silence. But, it's been a hard go, and I think there's been a lot of frustration over the years by people who really did try very, very hard to bring some of these issues forward. So, communication has the power to give issues salience. Okay? Communication has the power to give issues salience. The reason that I chose this particular um, photo here is this is from 1989, back when um, there was an uprising, particularly by students in China. And you might have heard of the Tiananmen Square massacre. Well, we in what, I'll call the West know about this. But for a long time, um, and to this day, the Chinese government cracked down on, anyone talking about this or this being communicated to people through the Chinese media outlets and so on. So it was like a mass blackout about this huge event, huge, and it was kept um, silent for decades. Why? I mean, why keep it quiet? Because if you acknowledge that an issue exists, if people are talking about it, that gives the issue salience. So you don't know what you don't know.